In my speech, I'll be attempting to do a few things. I'll be explaining what feminism means to me, I'll be explaining what feminism is, and I'll be debunking some common myths about feminism. So basically what I did for my personal project was I set up a blog on gender issues in Hong Kong. So just backtracking a bit for a moment. So why did I actually choose gender issues as the focus for my personal project? So this question actually occurred to me last night when I was drafting my third article, which should be out soon. So there was mainly one reason why I chose gender issues in Hong Kong. It's because there's a lack of communication regarding gender issues in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we tend to sweep a lot of things under a metaphorical rug, particularly when we're talking about relationships or sexuality. We don't really talk about gender expectations and gender roles and the significance it plays in our life because we're already conditioned into conforming into gender roles that are often extremely restrictive. For Spectral Hong Kong, gender issues refers to LGBTQIA issues and feminism, but I'll be talking about feminism today because I feel more qualified to comment on it. So, if it wasn't already obvious enough, I identify as a feminist. So the immediate reaction when I get that is, when I tell people that is A, disbelief, B, derision, or C, curiosity. And this is probably due to a few misconceptions and myths about feminism. I've gotten a few questions and comments directed at me since mostly by guys, since I've published my first article called The F Word on my blog back in October. So some of the most common ones are, why are you a feminist? Are you a feminist because you hate men or are unhappy? Why are you so angry? And my favorite one is, you're what's wrong with feminism. It's actually been quite interesting to see some of the reactions that people have posted to the blog, particularly as I have posted another one regarding LGBT issues, and it hasn't been nearly as controversial or polarizing. I think as a society, we're not really ready to question gender roles in Hong Kong. So what does feminism actually mean to me? So to me, feminism is all about choice and autonomy. However, there are a few factors that make feminism different from other gender equality movements, such as egalitarianism. Number one, it's female-centric. And this should be fairly obvious, but it's often the most hotly contested factor about feminism. So to me, feminism is for anyone who identifies as a woman. It's a movement for anyone who identifies as a woman. It's by women and of women. It's a movement in which men are expected to be more of like allies and listeners rather than active participants. So to put that in context, that's just, it's like how heterosexual people are allies to the LGBT movement. So there are a number of reasons for this, and I'll go into them later when I debunk a few myths related to feminism. So with that being said, feminism as a woman-centric movement does not ignore the needs and problems facing men, and I'll address that later on. So number two, intersectional. So this is kind of a mouthful. So what intersectionality basically is, it examines how various social factors like race, sexual orientation, and class interact on multiple or simultaneous levels and contribute to existing systems of oppression. So why is intersectionality so important? It's because feminism isn't a one-size-fits-all movement. Different women from different backgrounds have unique experiences and as a result have different needs. Feminist discourse, particularly in the last half-century, has often been dominated by a certain subset of women, and this often leads to the marginalization of other groups of women on grounds of race and sexual orientation. So number three, feminism is critical. Like critical as in not I'm gonna die critical, as in it's criticizing existing social structures and social hierarchies we have in place. It's all about examining existing oppressive social structures and finding ways to change the current status quo. And that often requires admitting that there's a problem in the first place and criticizing the current state of affairs. I think one of the reasons as to why people are so somewhat uncomfortable with the idea of feminism is that because it forces them to A, acknowledge the privilege they have on an individual level, and B, recognize that existing social structures cause oppression. So okay, I've talked about this problem and our need to recognize the problem for a really long time. So what actually is the problem? So feminists recognize and acknowledge that there's a very special type of social structure that primarily contributes to existing gender inequalities. Now, this is commonly known as the patriarchy, although some people like to use the term kyriarchy to reflect the full operation of intersecting oppressions. So no matter what the word used to describe our current method of class stratification, it can't really be denied that society is currently arranged into this really strict hierarchy, placing males of a certain age and socioeconomic class at the very top, with most of the power and disproportionate representation in other areas of life. Okay, so with that being said, the current system of oppression does hurt both men and women. So the patriarchy perpetrates these unhealthy gender stereotypes and ideals that hurt both men and women. So in the case of men, these ideals include but aren't limited to these problems aren't limited to a lack of support in groups for the emotional and mental needs of men, B, other issues like paternity leave, and C, aggravation of violence towards men. So feminism, what it basically does, it aims to dismantle this current system of oppression that unfairly favors a certain type of masculinity over others, and that men often can't live up to. And at the end of the day, it addresses both of these inequalities on both fronts. Okay, so moving on, what is feminism? I've gone on and on about the problem. So there are varying answers to this, but at its broadest, the feminist movement primarily deals with issues affecting the status of women in the world. So a feminist is, in my book, is someone who works towards social equality for all genders, irregardless of race, class, and religious background, and other social factors. It's a constantly evolving conversation that shifts and changes according to the times, and it's still very relevant today. So, okay, as I mentioned earlier, feminism aims to dismantle systems of oppression. By this, I mean feminists work against the system, not individuals in this case. We don't aim to take down men and build some completely female supremacist society, because that's not what feminism is all about. So now I'll move on to some popular myths about feminism. So one of the most popular misconceptions that people have about feminism and gender equality in general is that the problem of gender inequality doesn't really exist. So myth one, what I like to call the "we are already equal" myth. So people quote this all the time. They say that, oh, there are more women in boardrooms nowadays. There are more women than men in certain countries and institutions of higher learning. My favorite one is this: women have the right to vote, drive, have access to education. That's why gender inequality doesn't exist. It's extremely easy to deny a problem when we live in such a privileged society where, for the most part, women are kind of seen as on equals as men. So, okay, so why is this a problem? Because we can't be lulled into a sense of false complacency when women all around the world, and I'm not just talking about in Hong Kong, still face crimes such as genital mutilation, forced prostitution, honor killings. Because even when we look at women, the status of women in first world societies, issues such as the pay gap, sexual harassment, rape culture, victim blaming are still prevalent. Okay, and furthermore, just because women have the right to own property, to vote, and be educated in most developed countries, doesn't mean that they always enjoy the same standard of living as men. The way I like to put it is legal equality, that is, the equality in the eyes of the law, doesn't always translate to social equality. Okay, moving on to myth 2, reverse sexism. So people like to quote examples of this like, oh, but men can't hit girls and they're expected to pay on dates. The thing is, reverse sexism doesn't actually exist. Much like racism, sexism is prejudice or discrimination, plus institutional power. But by institutional power, I mean that some groups are more represented in positions of power, like the government or the media. While some women may be prejudiced against men, which is not okay, as a social group, they lack the institutional power to oppress men. The things that are considered to be a result of sexism against men, like favoritism towards women in divorce cases, the invisibility of male assault victims, etc., are actually the effects of the patriarchy. The patriarchy perpetrates the belief that in the case of divorce cases, that women are always better carers for children. Patriarchy tells male victims of sexual assault that speaking out against sexual assault and sexual violence is a sign of weakness. Now, feminism doesn't cause sexism against men. Sexism ultimately aims to dismantle this current system of oppression and ultimately help men. So number 3, petty issues. One I like to call, why are we complaining about this when XYZ is much worse? So feminism isn't really a zero-sum movement. You can work on some issues and not neglect others. I probably phrased that really badly. But when we say something like, oh, people in insert developing country, women in insert developing country here have it much worse than Hong Kong. Why are you complaining about the pay gap when people still get killed for wearing trousers? It's because this derailing tactic often has a tendency to slide into racism, and when you ask questions like, who cares about the sexualization of women in media when there are still oppressed women in, say, Africa or the Middle East? Because this derailing tactic enables people to shift their responsibility and guilt when accusations of sexism hit just a little too close to home. By crying out women have it worse in this developing country or in this society, it allows people to feel that they're not the worst sexist around. And it provides little impetus and incentive for them to change and for self-examination. Okay, number 3, the issue of men, the myth that feminism is exclusionary and doesn't include men or doesn't address men's issues in this world. Okay, so basically some feminists may disagree with me, but I feel that feminism as a safe space for women around the world, it should be a place where men are expected to be allies and listeners instead of active participants. So why do I actually think this way? Because as members of a privileged class, men don't really know, can't really truly understand the things that women experience. Besides, women work towards dismantling sexism and the patriarchy, not individually demonizing each man that does something that's not socially acceptable. So to sum it up, it's feminists work towards the betterment of women, not the degradation of men. Okay, so I know that I've probably brought all of you guys through a lot of content in a very short amount of time. But at the end of the day, for many of you, this talk about feminism may be new. And personally, I didn't really identify as a feminist until probably around 2 years ago. And even then, I wasn't really eager to tell people that I was one. But if we just stop and look around us, we see that a lot of people in the Hong Kong community still don't recognize that the issue of gender inequality exists. Now, I'm not saying that we should all be feminists, although that may sound like what I'm trying to say right now. But it's totally understandable if you're not ready to identify yourself as a feminist at this stage in time. Gender issues are highly overlooked in Hong Kong, and I definitely feel like it's something that we need to examine. This comes back to my personal project, Spectra Hong Kong, where I deal with gender issues about Hong Kong, and one of the slogans for my talk is Ignite, Inform, Inspire. I hope today my talk has ignited a new idea in your head, informed you about the current status quo, and inspired you to enact some change of your own. Thank you.